Welcome to the Flora and Fauna Annual Kaitiaki Forum for 2023. The topic for today's discussion is key concerns and issues around the predator-free 2050 policy. My name's Asha Andersen and I'm one of the 3 trustees of Flora and Fauna of Aotearoa, here along with Hannah Blackmore and Felicity Taylor, who are watching in the background. We warmly welcome you to this discussion, and it should be interesting no matter your perspective. We're very aware that there are some predator-free groups here joining us, so it's fantastic, I think, to have a wide range of people who can listen in and who can share thoughts on this topic. So it will undoubtedly raise a number of issues that have simply not been addressed due to the absence of debate on this issue. And the discussion may raise more questions than answers, but we hope that it starts off some genuine and necessary dialogue in the conservation space between a diverse range of people. This is likely the first in a series of discussions, and we are aware that there are many differing views and values and approaches in conservation. We believe through dialogue and respect that we have the opportunity to develop our own ideas and share and make meaningful connections that will benefit our beautiful country and the wildlife that we share it with. So with that said, I'd like to welcome our 3 guests this morning: Dr. Wendy Pond, anthropologist and social ecologist from the Coromandel. Welcome, Wendy. Les Kelly, keen conservationist and the original founder of the predator-free New Zealand concept based in the South Island. Welcome, Les.
Thank you.
All right, and Shane Hyde, owner-operator of Ecoland, focused on sustainable land management in the far north. Welcome, Shane. So thank you all for joining us, and also thank you to all the attendees here for taking an interest in this topic. I'd like to introduce the topic a little more before we get started. Then I'll invite each of our guests to briefly share a bit about themselves, their background and their interest in this topic. Then we have a few short questions that we've already prepared for each guest. Then we'll get into a bit more of the detail around some of the key issues and concerns of this policy direction. And then the final 20 minutes or so, we'll open up to the attendees to turn on their videos and audio and to comment and ask questions. But please do keep your video and audio off until then. And we ask that all those attending please remain respectful and keep comments constructive and inquisitory. So with that, let's get started. So Predator-Free 2050 is a national conservation policy strategy to rid New Zealand of a number of introduced animals: rats, stoats, weasels, ferrets, and possums. These animals are negatively impacting the native and endemic biodiversity of New Zealand. But is Predator-Free 2050 good science? And does it make ecological sense as a national policy directive? Does it take into consideration the complex nature of our varied ecosystems and the web of relationships between organisms, including native, endemic, and introduced species? Is absolute eradication necessary or even possible? And if it is it ethical to eradicate long-established species, and to what ends? These are just a few of the questions that hopefully we can get into discussing. So that opens up the topic. I'd like to first invite Les Kelly, as the founder of Predator-Free New Zealand, to share a bit about your story on why you created this concept, why you created the feasibility study, which people can have a look at on your website, and what happened, and with the subsequent publication of your book, Duped. Would you please share a bit about that story with us and your, a little bit about you, Les, and where you're coming from?
Okay, thank you very much, Asha, and good morning to all of you, the panel. First of all, thanks very much for inviting us on to share our thoughts. Predator-Free New Zealand, the non-toxin one that we originated back in 2008, was for non-toxin, no toxins whatsoever. Unfortunately, the government of the day, through encouraging us to do the feasibility studies and so on and so forth, they decided that they wanted to run a predator-free concept. And there's a couple of reasons why they shouldn't be doing that, because we identified that the fact that if they wanted to raise considerable funds, and we were talking at that particular time tens of billions of dollars, which has been reduced now. But if it was a government entity, then that precluded any corporations or businesses giving them any funding, because it would be unethical. So that was one consideration. The other one was that people don't trust the government and don't trust the councils. So there had to be an NGO, a non-government organisation, to facilitate that the program. But in 2013, they decided that Dr. Gareth Morgan, Sir Rob Fenwick, and another guy called Kevin O'Connor went and registered the name without even telling us. All the time, they were encouraging us to develop this feasibility study and so on and so forth. They actually purloined it. What I would like to explain here at the moment is that PFN's 2050 Limited has absolutely no chance of success. No chance whatsoever. It is doomed to fail, and it's been planned to fail. We haven't had anything to do with any of the participants in that particular group for over 7-8 years now. We wouldn't touch them, because we know that whatever the strategies they have at the moment now is designed to fail. So what we want to be involved in it. My background is in the mining industry in Western Australia. 25 years. I came back here just to find a place to retire. So I walked around the South Island, slept in paddocks, and reconnected with the bush. And to my dismay, there was just everywhere I went, where there were wildlife in my younger day, there was just nothing. There was no kiwi, no kaka, no nothing, no kakariki. I was absolutely stunned. I didn't know anything about 1080, didn't even know it existed. I got talking to a lot of people, and they were telling me about the predators. So that's how the predator-free side come. We've never been anti-1080. We've never been banned 1080. What we have said is we will find an alternative, a non-toxin alternative. And fortunately for us, the three young men in Good Nature, they had started out on pretty much on the same year as we started out to make these non-toxin self-resetting traps. We got to know about that at around about 2009 when I was talking with Bill English, excuse me, and meeting with senior public figures. And we decided then that this had potential, and that's the way we would go. So when the theft, if you like to call it that, by the government of PFN's Predator-Free New Zealand, we tried every angle we could do it, every possible avenue to try and get the name back. But they've actually now destroyed the name. So it's a nonsense. The whole thing is just nonsense.
Thank you, Les. Yeah. And so could you share a little bit about your book? You've got a book that you've written about this story.
Sure.
Yep.
That's it.
Duped.
Duped. That is the true story behind Predator-Free New Zealand. And basically what it was is just that I wanted the truth to be out there. I didn't want people to, and I was getting abusive phone calls, emails, and so on and so forth about killing sentient animals and so on and so forth, which really came back from Bill Benfield's book, The Third Wave. People had got that and said, that the animals can coexist with our fauna. So to me, that just didn't do. So I thought, well, in 2018, there's no possibility of us getting the name back, and we didn't want it anyhow because it's been tainted. I thought the truth had to get out there so people could just see just what duplicitous people are out there, and they're riding this green wave, if you like, and they're duping people. And I feel sorry for all the people. There's many groups around New Zealand at the moment, predator-free, Miramar Peninsula, Wellington, and so on and so forth. And these people are being duped, but they're doing good work. Don't get me wrong. It's work that needs to be done. But the whole concept is being destroyed by these people, 2050 Limited.
Thank you, Les. Yeah, no, it's really fascinating. If anyone wants to buy Les's book, how should they get a hold of a copy of that book? In
the libraries.
In the
It's in the
library.
library.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Liz.
Yeah.
All right, Shane.
Sorry, yeah. It's on my Facebook as well. You go onto the Facebook,
Okay.
and you can read that. Yes, and
All
it's
right.
got all the feasibility studies. It's got everything that's needed. There's not one. We've probably had over 2,000 peer reviews, and only one critique, and that was from one of the people that I named and shamed in the book.
Okay. Yep. If anyone wants to buy that book, I think they can contact you via your email as well. Is that right? Do you have copies for sale?
No, I'm not going to do a reprint. I've done 3 reprints now.
Okay, go to the library. Yep, get a copy.
Library or on my Facebook.
Yep. Okay, thank you. Fantastic. Thank you, Les. Shane, I'd like to come to you now. You do a lot of incredible work here up in Northland in particular in regards to wild animal control, and you're also an inventor. You are the owner-operator of Ecoland NZ. Would you please share a little bit more about yourself and how you became interested in this topic and the work that you do?
Thank you, Asha, and other panel members and people looking on. I come from a perspective of sustainable land management. I've been lucky enough that the entire life has been focused on conservation through being passed through family members, forest and bird and all other entities. So I come today just really focused with sustainable land management, and what that is it's about enhancing what we have already. It's not looking at the history and pointing fingers at what's right or wrong. It's saying, how do we go forward from here in the most positive way? So one of the things that I would like to mention is Sandra Lee was in Conservation Department in 1999, and I wrote something, and it was basically a reflection of what I'd seen happening around for the previous 15 years, and that was that pest control was being done, but it was not actually getting to a point of making conservation gain in a lot of cases. So the work was lost straight away. So effectively, what I asked is maybe rather than having a focus on control, one should have a focus on eradication. At least then you'd get the control that we needed. So I guess I come with that there's been a big shift across the last 20 years to how one looks at the environment, and but now we need a big shift to be inclusive of all to participate in the landscape, and actually get something to happen, even if it's sustained control across the country, but utilising resources wisely, and having a focused and managed approach to what we're doing.
Thank you, Shane. Would you share a little bit about the possum control work that you do?
Possum control work is one element of sustainable land management, obviously. We started providing sustainable land management service in 1999. We've planted over 1 million native trees in the early stages, and we were doing restoration work, ecological work outside that of DOC or any other funded organisation. Pest control was quite a key component of that, and we've seen fern birds and brown teal and other things have large conservation gain once we did our work. That led on to, after chemical poisoning, which was part of the spray release program, I had a period of downtime, and when I got energy and was able to focus again, I was lucky enough to do DOC contracts locally, which was much appreciated. And from that stemmed automation. So the need for automation in a forest to defend boundaries when you're not working in an entire landscape. So in essence, sustainable design pulled out automated bait station and a selection of the tools that haven't yet come forward. And we're just trying to get that out so people can actually use it. And Predator Free came along 2014. We'd hoped that they would have been supportive, and today we still have little, if any, support from predator-free. I'm aware there's a lot of people out there doing a lot of good, and that's really awesome, but it's about building off the capacity of those that are already delivering. So, and there's lots of people out there that were delivering already that have been excluded. So it's how do we get that capacity working towards what the country wants or what the country decides to do going forward. Thank you,
Shane. Yeah, great. Thank you very much. And for those that haven't seen it, we did an interview with Shane and went to his property a couple of years ago now, where he shares his story of being chemically poisoned, as well as some of his good work and a wonderful walk around your beautiful bit of paradise. So that is on the People's Inquiry YouTube channel. We can share that again later. Thank you, Shane. Wendy, would you please share a little bit with us about who you are and what important work you are doing there on the Coromandel? You're on mute.
My apologies. Right. Okie doke. So I began my adult life as a young anthropologist working in the Pacific. And from that experience, I decided that I wanted to use my abilities to enable people in the community to have a voice. And eventually I became the secretary of an ecological group called Manu Waiata. And our work has been to advocate to government for protection of stream margins, particularly in the headwaters. And during that work, I came into touch with Kuautunu Environmental Action Group, KIA, who were led by Victor McQueen, who was totally dedicated to removing poisons from the Kuautunu Peninsula on the Coromandel Peninsula, where he has worked since 2007. So my engagement did begin with a commitment to trying to stop the use of 1080, both as an aerial program and in bait stations. And over the years, I came to discover that worldwide, scientists are discovering more and more that poisons used for wildlife, against wildlife, end up in the soils, and possibly 70% of the soil biota is being destroyed by chemical poisons. So with our many years of action to try and stop Department of Conservation from aerial poisoning our forests, which are enormously important on the Coromandel Peninsula because people grow up in this forested environment, and hunting pigs is very basic to many families for supporting the family diet. And of course, with Rongoa Maori, the forests are a major gathering source, particularly for materials from mature trees. And the medical herbalists will not take materials from a forest that has been poisoned. So whether it's poison in bait stations or whether it's aerial poisoning, it destroys the public use of our forests. So over time, as we got no traction whatever from Department of Conservation to stop poisoning, we pointed out that DOC is acting without a social license from the Coromandel community. No matter what we said, eventually one of the rangers simply came out and said, we're not consulting because we're going to go ahead and do it no matter what you say. So we realized at that point that what we needed to do was to engage the entire peninsula in a project whereby landowners themselves would stop using poisons, all poisons, whatever, if possible, on their own properties. And that began as a landowners alliance. And then Reihana discovered there was an island off the British coast that had created a bee corridor where people could walk across the island following the bee corridor, where there was no spraying and there was nature's verge, as Flora and Fauna is now discussing. So that's a project newly in our minds here, and we think it's a project that will engage, in which we can engage a very large part of the population, we hope, as people see the verges flourishing. So that's just a brief view.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you very much. I would like to just share a little bit about me and who I am, because I am going to be part of this discussion as well. I have been a vegetarian since I was probably around 10, for reasons of, loving animals and not wanting to contribute to suffering. And so for me, that was how I could, I suppose, it was something that I felt that I could do, because I always said to myself, if I don't need it to survive, then, I choose not to have it. So, I've been vegetarian now for maybe 30 plus years. And, but during that time, I think there's been a real evolution in thinking. And I have always had a very strong connection and deep respect for my ancestors. And I have roots in the Pacific. My grandmother is from Samoa. And so, thinking about all of our ancestors, all of our tribal ancestors, all of our traditional, the relationships that they had with animals was so, so important. And it wasn't about killing and suffering. It was about nourishing. It's about species nourishing each other in the food chain, in the cycle of life. And so I think I've developed a different level of understanding and acceptance of that. It's okay to take an animal's life. It's okay to take another life to nourish your own life. So when I come to this discussion about predator-free 2050, my objection, is more around the concern of the methods that are used and around the goal of eradication, which I'll talk a bit more about once we get into the discussions, and that we maintain a healthy relationship with animals, which doesn't mean that we don't need to control them at times, and that we have an obligation to look after our taonga species of this country, but it's thinking deeper about that relationship that we have with animals and not placing us above, which is what poisons do. They place us above the food chain. They take us outside of that natural order of things. Whereas I think that we need to be finding a way to work within that natural order of things. So I would like that, when a life is taken, that it's honoured, however it can be honoured. And so I see there's a lot of opportunities to do things better than how we are. And being part of the People's Inquiry, where we've collected the stories of many, many people on the chemical exposures that they've had and the damage that's been done to them, the direction that we're heading with this predator-free 2050, which is heavily reliant on aerial poisoning over landscapes, is very alarming. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from with that. So with that said, I'd like to now, we've got a few questions that I've already sent out to our speakers, just like a really short response on these first few questions, and then we'll get into a bit more of the meatier discussion. I know that many of the people that are attending today also have a lot of experience and interest in this area and are probably chomping at the bit. So write down your ideas and questions and comments. And when we open up for the Q&A afterwards, we'll welcome you on on board to further the discussion. So maybe just starting with you, Les, my first question, and I think you've already answered it, but we'll go again. So do you support the goal of New Zealand becoming predator-free?
Yes.
Okay. And so do you think that...
But not the method. But not the method.
Not the method. Okay. So you support the eradication of these animals?
As far as possible, yes.
As far as possible. Okay. So, and do you think eradication is necessary or even or possible?
Well, there's two examples I can use in the world. Alberta, which has got 3 times the landmass of New Zealand, in Canada, the province of Alberta, has been rat-free for 2007, since 2007. So they managed that without even the new technology that we've developed here in New Zealand, the self-resetting non-toxin trap. The other one is Western Australia, where I had a lot of experience in the desert. They haven't had a sparrow or a starling in Western Australia in memory, and they managed to keep them out. And it's harder to keep birds out over a 3,000 kilometre boundary with Northern Territory and South Australia. So is it possible? Well, we put a man on the moon. We had to try that. When I talked to Sir Paul Callaghan on a number of occasions, he analysed it and he said, it's worth a shot. Even if we didn't get to this stage where we were completely predator-free, what we would be doing is taking a lot of pressure off our natural fauna and flora as well. So the idea was that to shoot for the goal, shoot for the moon, and if we only got 3/4 of the way there, as Sir Paul said, he said that's going to be a lot better than what we've got at the moment. So is it possible? Well, we won't know until we give it a go, but certainly we would have to we just can't keep doing this. I fully agree. This poisoning is just madness. It's insane, the whole thing. I think that I sent you through a podcast where the death of insects. They gave us 15 years since 2019. If we don't get this right, that's the end of our food production. And we've lost over 80% of our insects in 30 years, 80%. Now and when we're talking about spreading this A1 toxin, which is an insecticide, and we're spreading it all around our countryside. You're quite right. It goes into our soils. It's going into our food chains. It's the whole thing is insane, and that's why we've had nothing to do with PFNZ 2050 limited.
All right, thank you, Les. I just want to clarify though the case in Alberta with the rats. You did mention to me that they use brodifacoum.
Yeah.
Yes, they did, and they sorry.
No, just clarifying that it was poison that was used in order to achieve that, right?
Well, yes, they did that, and as I understand it, they also used shotguns and trapping as well. So there was a whole broad spectrum. But that was back in the early 2000s. So we've all moved on. The world's moved on from there. So I believe at the moment that that it is mostly all trapping and shooting now.
Right. Okay. And I did have one more brief question. Your reason for developing the predator-free New Zealand and for supporting eradication is because a big part of that is because you're concerned about the use of toxins in the environment and the way that it's being done now.
It's not my only consideration. It was just No, my main consideration at the beginning was, as I said, I couldn't even say the word brodifacoum. That's how dumb I was. I didn't even know there was a thing called sodium fluoroacetate. I didn't know what 1080 was. I saw all these signs on the West Coast when I was walking around the country. But what I did notice, there was just no birds there. There was just nothing. And even when I set up camp in rocky areas where there should have been skinks and geckos, there was just nothing there. So there had to be a reason for it. And I'm afraid 1080 is to blame.
Thank you. All right. Shane, so do you support the goal of a predator-free New Zealand? Of eradicating?
I do in the sense that it actually makes everybody aware that we do have a conservation issue, and that if everybody holds hands, regardless where you come from, that we can achieve a nicer place, a healthier environment to live in. I focus on that we're a small country with quite a small population, and everything has to fit within a budget. So it's more about getting the best result from the budget. So regardless whether you're a volunteer or a paid worker in auxiliary, or whether you're a self-employed person, it's about getting larger areas, at least some form of balance. Like I use the word balance, it is a game of balance. So if you want to go predator-free and eradication in a site, well, then it needs to be done in a balance as well. But there's lots of really good examples of areas without predators now. Aotearoa's one, where the birds and everything are excelling, but then you end up with the next step is, like any farmer that ends up with too many livestock, what do you do then? So
reintroduce
we need to increase habitat. Yeah, so,
yeah. So
habitat is one of the main things that we need to be focused on. A healthy habitat, then we can look out from that.
So the question then, I suppose, is eradication necessary to get those biodiversity gains?
Depends on the level of biodiversity gains. If you want kakapo in Northland, well, yes, maybe. But if you work with what you still have locally present, any pest control or any enhancement, whatever it might be, can be helpful to those existing species.
Okay. And so the follow-up question, do you actually think it's possible?
I participated in a science challenge in 2014, and one of my comments was there, I was asked the same question, and I said, yes, it is possible, but it needs to be done with military precision, and I don't see that at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Well, we'll come back to the question of possibility afterwards. But Wendy, so do you support the goal of predator-free 2050, a predator-free New Zealand?
Thank you. I'd like to just begin by saying how very greatly I respect Les Kelly and Shane Hyde, because their philosophy has grown out of doing the work. And I speak with much less experience, so please don't take me too seriously. Right, now, I would like to analyze the situation quite differently. First of all, for instance, rats are not predators, they're scavengers. I agree very strongly with Shane when he says that what matters is habitat, the quality of the habitat. So for me, it's a matter of understanding what species we've got on the Coromandel Peninsula and understanding what habitat they need and what population size each species needs in order to survive. And then look at what does that species need. Because on the Coromandel Peninsula, for instance, when I go up into the range, which has been mined and logged and burnt, and our forests are perhaps only 50 years old and very much lacking in the berry-bearing trees like Miro, then what I see is the floor of the forest is now a mat of ginger. And wherever the council has been working the tyres or the soil they've transported has brought in wandering dew, and the orange flowered, what we call the railway bulb, is spreading through the floor of the forest. So to me, the way to begin is to look at the habitat and look at the quality of the habitat and see what needs to be done in that habitat. So it's a very basic principle that a wild species will look after itself if it has habitat. So then the big problem is what is needed to give that species safe habitat in which it has adequate food and space and it can breed safely. And of course, that's where we come to wild introduced animals. I think what matters is not whether an animal's a predator or not. What matters is whether it's a smother species. And this now is a very serious problem. The Argentine ant, for instance, is a very vicious creature to have in our environment. And it's not ever thought of amongst predator-free. So I think we need to really understand which creatures it's important to eradicate, if any, and which creatures can be culled, like the Kaimanawa horses. I think some people understand very beautifully with Kaimanawa horses, and also deer cullers. Some deer cullers I find very noble in spirit. They would never wish to harm an animal or cause it suffering. And poisoning causes terrible, immense suffering. But the people culling the Kaimanawa horses and the people culling deer recognize that they need to have a herd that's suited to its habitat, so it doesn't begin to destroy the quality of that habitat. And by culling, they select the creatures. Maybe if there's an excess of males, maybe if there are poor creatures, not good in health, then these will be selected and culled. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you. All right. So just to add my 2 cents in, I do not support the complete eradication of these species. And I think Shane made an interesting point when if you eradicate these species and you get our native biodiversity numbers up, the birds that that are threatened species, and redevelop their populations, in a natural system, there would be predators that would take out, the sick and the weaker and animals, and that's how a predator manages a population. And so I think our biggest issue is that the number of these threatened species is so far down that it cannot accommodate the pressure that's coming at them from the predators. And it's my opinion that a lot of that is due to the last 100 years of poisoning. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the damage and the vulnerability of these populations can be linked to that. So I don't support eradication, but I certainly understand that that alleviating the pressure and controlling animals in certain areas to allow a native species to build up their numbers and to build up the populations, and those are really important ways that we need to be protecting them and supporting them. I think that when you step into the space of eradication, you invite poison because realistically it's not possible, and we can see that with these offshore island eradications, it's all about poison use. And then the other thing is, if it's not poison, we know that they're looking at gene drives, and genetic modification of these wildlife in order to, prevent them from breeding. But that in itself is an ethical minefield, genetically modifying wildlife. And then there's the possibility of that wildlife, like a rat, for example, a Trojan rat, being exported overseas, and affecting, wildlife around the world. I think that it's important for us to understand what the implications of eradication are as well. So I have questions around our native predatory birds who feed on these animals. Rats and mice are a primary food source for some of our native owls, for pukeko, so for some of our predatory birds, that is a primary food source. What happens when that's taken away? What do they switch to? likely small birds, more lizards. You know, so I think that the goal of eradication is too simplistic, and focusing just on these animals is too simplistic, and it doesn't allow for the complexity that is the ecosystem and the food chain, you know. So I think there's some big, deeper questions there. Shane and Les, is this something that you've thought about? You know, if rats, for example, were completely eradicated, and mice potentially as well, because I know that it has been talked about. What do you think about, you know, the follow-on effects for some of these other native important taonga species, and beyond? Anyone want to respond?
I would just say that a long time ago, I was intensely doing our local community areas free, collecting fur, and took away a huge amount of possums. And I did worry about the hawk at that stage, because they used to collect the possums each day off the roads, and there were hardly no possums on the roads anymore. So obviously those hawks, they either the population was bigger than what the local habitat could sustain without the possums on the road. So they would have had to change. And we had neighbours complaining that the hawks were jumping in and killing adult ducks in their duck pens and things like that, which is probably a consequence of that removing of the possums in the local area. But so you are completely right there. The same as if you remove the rats, we're seeing it already in some of the local pine forests, where intensive pest control's been done by other groups around. The mice population is exploding, which we haven't seen before. So again, it comes back to understanding what you're actually, the impacts on the total environment, and understanding, you know, whether the habitat is a one that needs eradication, or how we manage that. And I don't think it's straightforward.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, it's not. And I think that's what we need to engage with, is this is the complexity of it, and to understand, build an understanding and knowledge around the relationships between, you know, these wildlife. Les, is that something that you are concerned about, or have you thought about, you know, the flow-on effects from actually taking these animals out of the system?
It's something that we considered very, very seriously. When we said eradication, we set ourselves a goal. So we just said, right, that's where we go. If we went and said, well, we're only going to do 50% of any population of species, then, you know, how do you judge that when we got to the 50% or whatever it is? I would make the point, though, that our ruru have survived over millions of years without rats and mice as prey. And I have got first-hand evidence in the Flora Sound where Tui Nature's Reserve, using non-toxin methods, either adopt 150s or 200s, but then they switched in the early 2010, 12 into the good nature self-resetting traps. Now, those folk got their Tui Nature's Reserve down to virtually zero mice, rats, and also stoats. The Titi Islands, Jane Davis, the late Jane Davis, she did the same in the Titi Islands. And I've seen videos Jane showed her before her death of just the success after eradicating the rodents from Titi Islands. Even the Kaumatua, who opposed her when she was wanting to do the islands, he was just absolutely blown away just by the diversity of the wildlife. And Shane's quite right. Nature finds its own balance. We don't have to do anything. But the problem we've got now, and I do personally, when we were looking at it 2008, 2009, we felt we were in crisis point then. Now, what we're talking now, what are we talking? Another 13, 14 years. And it's just been madness with the 1080. You're quite right. You know, the one thing we've all got to remember, that the government's not going to give up on it. And we've got to try and have an alternative, because they're going to keep on, and so will forest and birds, so will land care and the poison industry. They will keep on saying, we've got to get rid of them, got to get rid of them. Okay, I'll bear some of that responsibility. But the fact is that we're going to do it anyhow. And we've just given them an avenue for them to do it, which is PFNZ 2050 limited. And so, yes, we've got to do something. Balance nature's wonders on the peninsula, Aotearoa's peninsula. He doesn't use any toxins. He uses good nature traps and live and shooting ferrets, which I'm engaged in now at the moment, and around South Island. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, how do we stop the government with this poisoning, this madness, this insanity? And that's why I'm here today. I'd like to see some answers on that.
Yes, okay, thank you. Yeah, excellent. All right. So I think I suppose the next question is, in your mind, what are the social, ecological and cultural problems that might arise from eradicating these animals? And I think that some of this has already been covered, really. Ecological, I mean, we've just spoken about the complexity of the ecosystem and having to really understand the relationships between these animals. Cultural problems. Any thoughts on any cultural problems that might arise? I mean, for myself personally, as a vegetarian, I have a property that is 5 hectares of native and exotic forest, and I do not trap there. We've been there for 10 years, observing and interacting with that forest, but without really having an impact on it. It is directly opposite the Puketi forest, which is where Shane does some of his trapping, and we have resident Kiwis that we hear regularly, multiple Kiwis that live on this land. We also have many tomtits, which are there daily, and each season we can see the tomtits feeding their chicks in our garden and around the forest. Many moorpork who I've mentioned, I'm concerned about taking that food source away from them, and the potential pressure that they might put on some of the other species that are there that are already vulnerable. And of course there are possums. I mean, last night we heard possums and pigs outside our door, so that there is a presence there. And definitely many hawks as well coming over from the neighbour's place. So there's a diverse range of wildlife. Cowrie snails, we regularly find cowrie snails on our land, and we don't do any trapping there. Now, that is a decision that we have made because we have felt that it wasn't necessary. And we have not seen decline since we have been there. But this is all relative to our time there, and our, and the amount of observation that we've put into it. But there's people like myself who actually may choose not to participate in eradicating these animals. So I think that's an important aspect, that our country consists of many different people with many different views and many different values that they place on animals, that won't be willing to participate in this, eradication. So for me, heading towards eradication really raises a lot of issues. I know that there are many people as well who are very concerned about the warlike military nature. And I know you said before, Shane, if we want to eradicate all these creatures, we need military-like precision. And that has been a feature of Predator Free 2050 and the New Zealand conservation, is that it comes from a very militaristic, warlike perspective, battle for our birds, and eradication. So I think of all the vegetarian and the vegan and the Buddhists and, people who are not, who don't resonate with the idea of absolute eradication or even killing, so we've got a full spectrum of people in this country. were there any thoughts that you guys had to share on that? You know,
I'd just I'd like to make the comment that we all are within one country, but we have probably 3.5, 4 million different viewpoints. So collectively, we approach things with the direction of conservation or financial gain or sports or recreation. Or lifestyle, or, you know, it goes on. But in reality, if we all just embraced sustainability and focused on that, all those elements come together. Just focusing on conservation purely isn't actually being sustainable. So hence, if we're pouring money that society's made through non-sustainable means into conservation, well, maybe we might get a result, but we're still not living within our means. We're not being sustainable. And then to rely on other industries or providers to mitigate our cost because we haven't economically delivered correctly, then you're non-sustainable again. So again, at the bottom line, if we choose to do something, it needs to be done with consideration to where the dollar comes from and how it was created in the first place. So hence there's lots of ways to achieve the end goal. Some of the best ways is to encourage the capacity of those that operate with the lowest impact. So hence a ground control pest controller who's already semi or self-employed. I'm not sure why they're not being supported.
Thank you, Shane. I'd like to see us embrace a variety of different approaches. I guess that's what I'm saying, you know, is that complete eradication, I think is not possible, and it excludes a lot of people, you know, who maybe want to contribute in this space but don't agree with that ambition. And so I'd like to see, you know, a variety of different sanctuaries, a variety of different approaches to conservation that allow for the many different voices and the many different values to be heard and to be expressed. And right now it's very controlled and very corporate and very narrow in its focus.
I agree with that, Asha. I'll just like to address that thing about using military terms. That was coined by Dr. Gareth Morgan. He was one of the signees who overtook the name. So he was the fellow that come up with the Battle of the Birds, fighting this, and it's got to be a warlike thing. We never, ever had that in our vocabulary. And, you know, the one thing that disturbs me very, very much at the moment is that they're asking school children to go out and kill possums and doing it without any sort of inhumane ways. And they're doing it as a blood sport. And I find that abhorrent. Now, all I can say is that I have seen places where it has been, we've had total eradication. And Two East Nature's Reserve was one. We haven't quite got there on the peninsula, Otago Peninsula, but the benefits to the natural wildlife is unbelievable. And I do know that there are people around who believe that we should just leave the status quo. Fine, that's fine, but what we've got to realise is the government is going to do it anyway, and they're going to keep on keeping on. And you find some way of connecting with the public that you're trying to convince that this concept whereby our fauna will learn to coexist with introduced species. Well, yeah, that's going to be very difficult, because you can bet the Department of Conservation, Forest and Bird and the rest of them, they're going to be right in the corner keeping the poison industry in business. And they're going to, they've spent 50 years convincing the New Zealanders that we've got a problem, and now we've got to try and undo that. Well, the only way we could see it, doing it back in 2009, was saying, well, let's do an eradication.
Well, a few short comments to respond to you. the slogans and the military type language, and even predator free 2050, it's catchphrases. I understand why it's used and how it can motivate people, and us, from a marketing perspective, it's brilliant, it's genius. But from a reality, I think when we actually think about the impacts of these things on our own psyche and our relationship with those animals, and as you said, with children, getting children involved in a way that doesn't honor these animals, in a way that just treats them as an other, and it actually develops hatred. I think a while ago I saw a video of some guy punching a possum. And I think that, so when we, and I think this is tied up for me personally in the whole concept of eradicating, to fully want to exterminate every last one of you, whatever you are, that it creates this distance from us, and it emboldens us, I think, to go to extraordinary lengths that we perhaps normally wouldn't go to, without this added impetus to completely exterminate something. I don't know, does that kind of resonate with people? I really think that it does kind of put us on that trajectory of actually hatred of another species.
Well, I think we've got a choice here. Do we protect our native fauna, or do we have consideration for introduced species? And
we do both.
I've seen myself a piwakawaka in the mouth of a stoat with its neck just completely snapped. I've seen kiwi that have been attacked by stoats. And it's not a pretty thing. And when we're talking about, like, I believe that you wanted to talk about feral cats. Well, I've spent the last probably 5 years now going around the South Island, live trapping and shooting the cats. It's not something I enjoy doing. I don't like killing people things. But when we have students come down and open up the gut of a cat and find 17 skinks or geckos in the gut, where the geckos have had no chance whatsoever, that cat, I'm afraid, just doesn't belong there. So we have a choice to make, and it is a hard one. I understand it, and it's not one of our own making. It's our forefathers and so on. But we have to. Well, we've got a choice. Do we look at the native fauna, or do we go
absolutely.
with?
It's not a one or another. I think it's absolutely agree that we need to manage wildlife, introduced wildlife, manage these species that are doing the damage. There's no question about that. My point is more about that step to the final solution of attaching ourselves to the goal of eradication and all of the implications that in itself has. So there's absolutely no question that that we need to act, and many people are doing wonderful work doing that. But it's about whether it needs to, control is control, but when you take that next step and jump to eradication, is that necessary, or is a certain level of control necessary, and that the benefits can be felt without that extra step of eradication? I agree.
Yeah, I agree. I think that you've hit the nail on the head. It was probably a mistake in the first place, but and you said about the marketing, we employed a marketing and promoting company at the beginning, and when we said predator free, then they said, well, how do we do that? You've got to get predator free, you're going to have to eradicate. So we didn't see that as a problem, but what we did see now with the way that it's turned out, yes, it has eradication. Is just take it away from there. Just go down to the control level. We've got no problem with that. All we want to do is try and protect what we've got left of our wildlife.
I think if we can slightly shift focus to a more holistic approach, rather than the slash and burn and this. If we can shift to a more holistic approach, then what we actually do is we invite other people into the space to take collective action as well, who maybe have not been completely alienated by, you know, this very narrow, simplistic view of what we can do to help our native biodiversity?
Yes, I agree. There's no problem with that at all, Asha. I think you've hit the nail on the head.
All right. Was there anything else, any other comments before we move on to one of the final questions, and then we'll be getting to opening up the floor?
I'll just comment on this, that I think what we have to do is find something that is a much more attractive goal to the public than predator-free. And I don't know what that is, but I think that's something that we need to explore. And certainly one of the steps on the way is to move out of forest and bird and into flora and fauna. And one of the joys of flora and fauna is that it's accommodating all these different approaches. So like the nature verge, a bee corridor, and other people are working on from mountains to the sea, where they collect together all property owners in one catchment and work collaboratively to restore that catchment. I think that's a very attractive objective, mountains to the sea, that you're guarding your own catchment and dealing with predators or some other species is one of your objectives within restoring the catchment. But certainly we have to find an idea that will fly with the public.
I agree, Wendy, and thanks for your comment. We did actually try to get a community in the Pelorus Sounds together. It was a 14,000 hectare project called the Two Peninsula Project, but it included 30% of it was conservation estate. We actually got a letter from the Department of Conservation giving us a moratorium for 10 years of no toxins being used in that particular area whilst we carried out non-toxin trapping and shooting. But unfortunately, we had infiltrators from the department. One, we found out later, one of the committee was an ex-ranger from DOC who just disrupted every meeting we had till the point that everybody else just walked away from it. And so we've got a problem there with the conservation department. Shane is quite, excellent comments, because he has been up against the conservation department like all of us have. And it is because they control most of the areas, and all they want to do is keep putting on the toxins. So yeah, I agree. The mountains to the sea, brilliant idea. We've got one down here in Canterbury, I believe, that comes trying to get it all the way down from the Southern Alps, and the Rata and the Pahutakawa. So yeah, these are brilliant ideas. We've just got to come up with something that can capture the public's imagination. And I think, Asha, when we were talking on the phone, you were talking about poison-free New Zealand. What a wonderful idea.
Absolutely, yes. I told Leds that I fully enjoyed reading his feasibility study, and if we could just take out predator-free New Zealand and put in poison-free New Zealand, and it absolutely. And I think that takes us on to our next question, which is around an issue that is not talked about in this country, and is one of the reasons why Flora and Fauna was formed in the first place, is the fact that we are not looking at these the history of the use of chemical poisons in this country as a primary cause of biodiversity loss and leading us to the current day crisis, extinction crisis. In this country, we are so far behind, and we are so much in denial about the impacts of these chemical poisons, which are being airily dropped over hundreds and hundreds of thousands, if not millions of hectares of this country, and have been done so for the last 5+ decades. Actually, the first aerial drop over New Zealand, I believe, was in the late 1940s to kill rabbits, and this was that pilots, you can listen to Justine Phillips' testimony to the People's Inquiry, and she is an environmental historian and ecologist, and she shares a fascinating testimony to the inquiry about the fate of the kuri dog and the kiori rat and the kia and the impacts of poisons on those. And it was those species at the time that the colonial thinking and the agriculturalists actually thought were pests, and they began poisoning and exterminating them. So, you know, now in retrospect, we look at those as native animals, you know, so what is a pest develops over time. Anyway, my point is that she gives a fascinating testimony that recounts the way in which this country has been poisoned. And if we look at the impact of pesticides, in particular on avian species, you know, it's just devastating, the damage that is done to birds in particular, making them so much more vulnerable to predation. So I guess my question is, you know, to all three panelists, so, I mean, do you think poisons have played a role in the current biodiversity extinction crisis? And do you have any experience of this yourselves?
My answer to that is no. It's got no place whatsoever to be in New Zealand. In fact, there's no necessity with these new traps that are out there now. There's no necessity for any toxins whatsoever.
Right. So, Les, do you think that the use of poisons has contributed to the decline and the current extinction crisis that many of our species are facing now?
Yes, definitely.
Okay. Shane, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's obviously I've been chemically poisoned, so there's elements here that would suggest that we need to use the tools we have a lot more wiser. At the end of the day, it comes back to management. So it doesn't matter what tools you use. It's the management of those tools. So Irma was interesting. They said in 2008 that aerial 1080 should be the last resort, not the first resort. So hence we shouldn't be using chemicals for convenience. And if we do need to use them, it needs to have good reasons. But I would say for this one, with the use of cyanide, an operator can be up to 600% more efficient per visit in what it's doing, so or the person's doing for the control of possums. So it comes back to budget again.
Thank you, Shane. Wendy, did you have any thoughts on, you know, the impacts of poisons on our birds?
I'll say immediately, Victor McLean, who has been trapping for a good part of his life, he is also a strong supporter of using cyanide. Totally opposed to poisoning, but using cyanide, yes, it seems very effective, and it doesn't have a residual effect the way other chemical poisons do. So I think there should be much more use of cyanide, probably. The Russians did an experiment in Siberia with controlling animals they didn't want. They tried trapping, and they tried poisoning, and they tried target-trained dogs. And dogs proved to be by far the most effective method. And Doc knows this because Victor McLean had a very brilliant dog he'd trained, target trained for catching rats. And Doc took Victor and his dog to an offshore island. And it was with the dog that they exterminated the rats. They'd been using poisoning, but it was the dog that did the final job. So Doc knows, and we need to ask, why is Doc using poisoning? And of course, another effect that has happened with the poisoning of the forests, the pig hunters no longer hunt pigs for family meat. And now the pigs are breeding prolifically and invading the farmland and causing a lot of trouble. So it's all been managed very badly. I'll just to say briefly that Jodie Bruning put before us a pie, a circle of the impacts on the planet, and she drew it as planetary limits. What are we doing that is beyond the scope of the planet to cope with our impacts? And the two largest, most serious sections of the pie are species extinction and chemicals. So chemical poisonings, one of the worst possible things we could be doing to the planet. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy, and very fascinating about the use of the dog. And that is something that I have thought myself, actually, about alternative ways of doing this. And I think it's also really important to mention, Shane, you mentioned Shane uses encapsulated cyanide tablets. And it, you know, while Flora and Fauna and you know, while we would like to see, you know, the use of toxins, you know, no need for the use of toxins, I think that it's very important to acknowledge that there is a hierarchy of toxins. And when with encapsulated cyanide, you know, it is the most humane kill because it happens very quickly, and there is no residual poison, as Wendy stated. And that one of the most important things, it's not being indiscriminately aerially distributed over land and water. You know, so I think it's really important to note. Yeah. Wow. So I think that there's, you know, we could keep talking for a long time, but I think it's important to just maybe leave it there and see what our attendees have to share, if that's all right. I think we've touched on a lot of different topics, and many of them we could get into, you know, in a lot more detail, but I will leave that for future sessions.